welcome to another episode of Jacob's House of Rock. And today, we're going to be setting the bias on this lovely Laney GH100L 100-watt tube amplifier. Now, if you've been following my channel for a little bit, you would have seen a little unboxing that I did on this amplifier, and then a little bit of a test with some new tubes. And yeah, this thing, it arrived to me secondhand with broken tubes, so I needed to replace them. But the thing about replacing tubes in a tube amplifier is it's not always as simple as just plugging in the new tubes and playing. There's a little bit of a feature within the electronics of a tube amplifier that does need tweaking. It is known as biasing the amplifier. Now, this is usually best left to a professional to do, as these types of amplifiers, or tube amps in general, they have very large capacitors, very large power transformers, and very high voltages within this chassis right here. So it is generally not advised, if you're not confident doing this sort of stuff, to get a professional to do it. The reason I'm doing this is because I'm somewhat electronically inclined. I've done my fair share of electronic stuff, nothing really at these wattages, so ideally I did want to send this to a professional. However, that shit was bloody expensive, and I did my research, and it seems pretty simple once you get down to it. You just kind of need somebody to explain it to you well, and then it seems pretty easy. So I'm going to be attempting it here. Now, I want to advise, I'm not a professional. I'm just a hobbyist who seems to have got his head around this and, you know, learned some stuff from some other videos. So do not do this technique solely from watching my video. If you don't already know how to do this, I implore you, go check out some other videos, some other resources, ask around, some really good Facebook groups about amp repair and tube amp repair in particular and stuff like that. There's more than enough people in there who will be happy to help you and guide you through something like this. I will have resources in the description below of some of the videos that I use to help me, and there's also a really good website where it goes really in depth into how to do stuff like this, as well as like a special calculator, because you do need to do a couple of little calculator measurements, but nothing too intense, and I'll run you through that later in the video. Before any of that, let's talk about what you're going to need for a project like this. Now, there's a lot of different ways to do this, and you can do this at a lot of different price ranges and with a lot of levels of tweaking. I opted for the most safest version and the most sort of user-friendly one. It is a tiny bit more pricey, however, not that much more pricey in all honesty. First thing you're gonna need is a multimeter. You can get these pretty cheap. They're very useful if you're doing a lot of electronics. These are basically just little probes that you poke into certain parts of electronics, and you got a whole bunch of different functions on something like this. The setting we're going to be having it on today is we're going to be checking the cathode to plate voltage, which is generally around 400 to 500 volts. So we're going to have it set to the highest setting on the volts on this one, which is 600 volts. Now, hopefully this one will be accurate enough. I mean, biasing an amp isn't an exact science. There's no, like, absolute sweet point. There's quite a range that you can get it. You should also specify the reason that you bias an amplifier. I don't know the exact specifics of it. Like I said, I'm not a super electronics expert. I just kind of dabble in this stuff. But basically, it's just setting the appropriate currents running through all the tubes just so they function at their best. The amp's performance will vary quite drastically based on this, so if you turn it up too high, your amp will sound really meaty and saturated, but it will run through your tubes really fast, and it could damage them, and potentially it could cause them to heat up so much that you get something called red plating, where these gray panels in here, they actually start glowing red, which is not what you want. Tubes are meant to glow red, but not the gray panels. There's meant to be a little filament in there that glows, and that's all that's meant to glow. And the other thing is, if you have it too low, your amp's going to sound really bleh, really just, it's not going to have that any oomph or character to the sound. Your tubes will last forever, but it's no point because it's going to sound like rubbish. I tried this thing out, just kind of putting these tubes in here, and I was having a weird response. It was just like, it sounded really flubby, but the sound kind of it lacked sort of a presence, but the distortion was like really either non-existent, or when you turned it up, it just suddenly turned really fuzzy and messy and horrible, and it didn't sound nice at all. And I'm hoping that that's just from it not being biased correctly, and I'm hoping when I do adjust that, it'll smooth itself out, but we'll see. First thing you'll need, multimeter. Second thing, obviously replacement tubes if you're doing this while replacing tubes. It's something that generally you should do every time you replace tubes. Now, some amplifiers don't require biasing, generally on the smaller tube amps, and the way you'll know that is you do some research on your particular amplifier. If it's a fixed biased amplifier, like this one, it means that you gotta fix the bias, which is a little roundabout way of saying that. But if it's a self-biasing amp, and you can pretty much put any tubes in there you want. Try to get matched tubes as well. So I got a set of 4 EL, I think it's EL34s, yes. These ones are these Mullard reissue ones. I was gonna go for the cheapest JJs, but these were honestly like not even that much more expensive, because already tubes are really, really expensive, so apparently these ones sound pretty good. We'll see. Main thing you're going to need for this particular process is a bias current tester for a tube amp. You can get these for a number of prices. There are some like proper brand name ones which go for hundreds of dollars, or I got this cheap one from China. Basically what this is it's a little multimeter that tests the current running through specific points in the tube. I forgot which exact points, because I have this probe, I don't actually really need to know that consciously, but the plate voltage thing will, you do kind of need to know that. I'll run you guys through that in a second. This one that I got in particular, it comes with 4 of these little leads, and you can see they have like a little jack with 2 connections, and that just basically is going to be testing the current through all 4 of these. And plug these things into your amp where your tubes should be, and then you plug your tubes in the top of these. So they kind of stack up, and that basically probes between them. What you could do if you're being like super cheap is you could make your own little probes with a broken tube. Create these little pins, then you put a little bit of a resistor and some other circuitry in between there, and you can use your multimeter. And on top of that you would put like a spare tube socket, and then you could put your actual tube in there and measure that stuff. Or you can actually solder directly into your board like a resistor and create some measurement points. And the reason I just got one of these is I don't want to mess with any of that. I don't want to have to put a soldering iron or anything anywhere near the inside of this amp if I can avoid it. Because like I said, I'm just kind of casual at this stuff, and I don't want to risk any sort of electrocution. So speaking of that, another thing I would advise you guys to get is some rubber gloves of some kind, some sort of insulation for your hands. Really good tip is to always use only one hand if you have to poke anything on the inside of the amplifier, and to have your other hand in your pocket or just away from the amplifier. That's a really good recommendation for that. And another thing is, don't poke the inside of the amp like when you're adjusting the bias thing, which the bias thing will be an adjustable resistor. So basically it's a resistor that has like a little screw hole that you turn, and that adjusts the resistance and thus adjusts the bias, and that's the whole idea behind this process. So I'd either get like a little plastic screwdriver, or what I'm probably going to do is I have a couple of chopsticks and some little wooden thingies here, and once I open it up and see what kind of a screw that needs, I'm going to cut one of these with a little whittling knife into the shape of a screwdriver, and then I'll have a little wooden probe that I can turn that with without having to touch anything. What I'm going to do to get started is I need to take this amp apart. I'm going to have to remove this chassis so we can actually get access to the little bias pot. Some amps actually have the little bias thing that you can adjust it from the outside. However, for like reasons, they decided to put them as hard as you can to reach on the inside for some of these older amps, just because they don't really want people who don't know what they're doing messing with them. However, now in the modern age of the internet, we got a lot of people who like to tweak this stuff themselves, and there's a lot more info about this stuff, so it's a little bit more user-friendly for the casual guitarists out there, because spending money on technicians is ooh, it's a lot if you're doing this regularly, because, you know, tubes go bad, you gotta change them, and you gotta buy some when that happens, and just, it's like buying a new amp almost every time you have to change the tubes with, you know, all the added costs. So I'm just one of those people who my general philosophy on stuff is it's good to know about, you know, learn about every aspect of this stuff that you can kind of do yourself, because you realize that a lot of the stuff that, you know, paid professionals do is a lot simpler than you might think once you understand it. Generally have this really DIY philosophy about a lot of things. So hopefully it doesn't get me killed with this amp, but I'm that's why I'm being very, very careful, and I implore you guys to be as well. So yeah, I'm gonna get right into this. I'm gonna take this thing apart, and we'll see what we're doing in here. Probably also have to clean it up because it is very dusty. I got her all cleaned up. As you saw there, I took this thing into the backyard, and then I just use a brush to brush away most of the dust up here. I could probably wipe some more off just quickly. May as well, you know, this thing is an old thing. I even saw a little note on the inside of it saying that this thing was tested in 95, so this thing is older than me by about a year, so that's really interesting. Our next step is going to be getting our plate of voltage. So the way we do that is we actually need to measure the voltage between two of these little pin sockets in here while the amp is running on idle, meaning it's got power running through it, but everything is, you know, off. So no guitar tone playing through this or anything like that. You can even just mute all the volumes and stuff like that. But we still want to know how much is that voltage is going to be the basis of our calculation to figure out how much we actually need to bias this thing. Now, normally the way you would do this is either you have a specific probe that's going to be very similar to the ones that we use to measure the current in these. So you would have a special probe that would look like this, that would do the same thing as this, except for instead of measuring the current through its different part of it, it would measure the voltage through, I think it's pins between pin 3 and pin 8. So that's one way of doing it, and you would also have the tube on at the same time. Another way to do it would be to take these measurements through the underside of the amp on the PCB side while the tubes are in and it's all hot and going. However, I saw a method where the dude actually got his multimeter. So he got his multimeter like this. It would be set to about here, like I showed earlier. So mine has 600 volts. Your multimeter would vary, but you need it to be over about 400 or 500 volts. And then you would take this probe and put it something like this. So between pins 3 and 8. Now I'll show you how to do that more precisely later on, and then that would give you the plate voltage. But right now you can see this thing is off. It's not plugged in at all, and already there's still tiny bit of voltage in here, although it's kind of hard to tell because like which amount you're expecting you kind of have to know to get these multimeters to work properly. But regardless, that's the way we're gonna do it. So apparently, like, there is a difference between the plate voltage while the tubes are in and while they're not in there, but apparently it is not a big enough difference to actually make the biasing bad, if that makes sense. And the reason I'm doing it this way is and showing you this way is because it is the safer, more convenient method of doing it, because you don't have to be poking probes into the PCB side of the amp, which is, again, especially while it's on, You want to be doing that as least as possible, especially if you're not confident with this stuff. Like I said, if you are, that is the better, like the slightly more accurate way of doing it. But I'm going to be just doing it this way, so I don't know. Almost every video on biasing amplifiers that I have seen has had like mixed opinions in the comments, so it's hard to tell like what's the universally accepted way. Everyone kind of has their own little way of doing it. Some people even do it by ear. So like I said, it's not an exact science. The way I saw this being done on that video did have the preamp tubes installed, so I'm not entirely sure if they have to be installed. I took them out during that like montage earlier just because I wanted them to not get damaged while I was cleaning up the top of this amp here. They are kind of dusty, these tubes are kind of old. Preamp tubes you actually don't have to bias. It doesn't really matter if they're matched or not, from what I understand, so you don't really have to worry about preamp tubes. You can just slot in any old appropriate tube. Like, I think these are like 12AX7s, something like that. So if your amp runs on 12AX7s, just use other 12AX7s, you should be fine. But it's the power amp section that needs to be biased for those to run properly. The preamp ones are just kind of, they basically just give you your tone, but the power amp ones kind of like, they give it the loudness, you know? The reason these guards are here are both to physically protect these tubes and to make sure they don't get radio interference, because preamp tubes are pretty susceptible to that. So you can actually get some like radio waves through your amp if you got a lot of like radio interference in your area or through your power system and all that stuff at your location. So now we're at the part where we're actually going to start to be doing some of the scary stuff, where we're actually going to have to plug this thing in. So the first thing you're going to want to do before doing anything is make sure you actually plug in a speaker into this amp, because you need something plugged in to the speaker section, some sort of a load, otherwise that could really mess up your tube amp. Tube amps are really susceptible to not having a speaker load in them. They could like damage them in ways that I've never seen before because I've been really careful about it, but apparently that's a really important thing when it comes to tube amps, just to make sure you actually have a speaker plugged in. Also make sure the speaker is at the appropriate amount of resistance, so the appropriate ohms that match the amp that you've got. This one has a couple of options. I've just got like a standard sort of 8 ohm speaker. The speaker that I'm using is only like rated at like 30 something watts, which isn't ideal for a 100 watt amp. However, if you're not running it at full volume, you're not going to be using anywhere near the full 100 watts. So I'm just going to use that just to have some resistance through here and just to test it lightly later in this video, but later on I'll test it through a proper speaker cabinet when this is all done. So the first thing we're going to do is plug in that speaker. Up here you see I got my custom built speaker cab here, 8 ohm speaker. Make sure you're using a proper speaker cable. This is a DIY cable that I built, but don't use a guitar cable. They are not designed speaker cables, even though they look the same superficially on the outside. The actual wire on the inside is constructed a little bit differently. So be mindful of that when you're doing this sort of stuff. That would be there. There we go. I'm going to go around to the front of the amp, and I'm just going to turn everything off onto mute for this process. Just make sure your power and standby is all off to begin with. It's kind of hard to tell on this amp whether it is or not because the off and on symbols have since rubbed off on the front. You can't see that, but you get my drift. And the next part we're going to do is we're going to have to plug this into the... So we just got our power plug here. It is already connected up to the mains, so we plug that in. Now we're ready to do the fun stuff. So the way we're going to measure this is we need to turn our amp on, so I'll just put it on standby for now. There we go. You guys can't see that, but the standby light is now shining on the power at the front there. And we should get some warmth from these little 12AX7 tubes here in a little bit. And then what we're going to do is we're going to get our multimeter, and we're going to turn this thing off standby, and then we're going to measure the current through here. Well, the voltage, I should say, the voltage. Alright, so I've got it sitting on standby. Now what we're going to do is we're going to start the fun stuff. So I got my multimeter here. Let's test our plate to cathode voltage. So the way we're going to do that is, like I brought up earlier, we're going to stick these probes into these holes here and measure that. I think it should be the same across all 4 of these. We can just double check that while we do this, because like I said, I'm new to this, but I've done my fair share of research, so hopefully this will work out nicely. But for now, that's how we have our multimeter set up. I got the little thing on 600 volts, or, you know, like I said, many times you want it to be at least over 400 volts, set to around that approximate area, depending on your multimeter. The way we put these pins in is we need the red pin here to go into the hole that corresponds to the pin number 3. So I have a little thing drawn up here for you guys. So there we go. There's a little diagram of the pinholes. You can see there's a little notch in this central hole here. This little notch. On either side of it, there's number 1, and the other side is number 8. Number 8, so we're going to put the black lead. So that's the black lead, goes into there. The red one goes into number 3. So I'll just take it off standby, because I think we need to have this amp actually on. So you need to have red one on number 3, so you find that little notch on one of these. And then you go off for the first one on the anti-clockwise side is number 1 from the top, like this. So that's number 1, 2, and 3. So we put our little probe in here. Okay, right now it's not registering anything because nothing's really going through. But then we put this negative probe into number 8. And that shows a plate voltage of, oh geez, it's jumping around, 484 to 5. So I'm gonna write 484. That's our base plate voltage right there. I'll just double check, like, if we get the same results, because I'm curious if we get the same results, 1, 2, 3, between all of these, or if it's 486, yeah, that's pretty close. 486. Four eight 484, 486, something around there. And 484, 483, yeah. So 484, 485 is about the average plate voltage between these, with the power tubes not plugged in. Again, it should change ever so slightly when the tubes are plugged in, but not enough to really make a difference and to warrant risking anything. Do that from the bottom, at least so I've heard by somebody who claims to have done this hundreds of times. I'll have his video posted in the description below, actually, just so you guys can watch his video. It'll probably be a little bit more concise and easier to understand than this. This is more just me showing off my first attempt at this and hopefully helping you guys out a little bit. Now that we've done that comes the fun bit, where we're going to be plugging in our tubes into those little doohickeys that we can measure the current. And then once we have those readings, we're going to do some math, and we're going to adjust the what's it called, the bias itself, by changing up that resistor. So I'm just going to turn this off. Turn that off standby for a second. Turn the power off for now. And yeah, let's get to that. We have our little tool here. Pardon the change in lighting. It's starting to get dark outside, so I needed to use a lamp. Yeah, we have a little tool here. It comes with 4 of these little doohickeys here. Technically, you don't really need one that has the same amount of tubes as you've got here. You can use one with only 1 lead. It just kind of helps to have 4, just because if you have an amp with 4 power tubes, then having 4 of these helps just check that all your tubes are running at about the same current and all that sort of stuff, and that the bias is affecting them evenly. But if you actually have a matched set of tubes, for example, I bought these as a matched set of 4, I shouldn't really need to use all 4 of these. Only testing 1 tube should be enough, because the bias affects all of them simultaneously. Now we plug these into these sockets here. So just match it up. There's only one way these will fit in here, because that inner pole has like a little E shape there that kind of locks it into the specific place. So I put put them all across in the specific areas. So this one we're going to call tube number 1. Doesn't really matter which order, to be honest, but put that in there into this tube A, and plug this one as tube B. Now, like I said, you can get these a lot cheaper. My one was one of the cheap ones from China, but it was also a slightly pricier one because it did come with 4. But like I said, if you're not planning on like doing this a whole lot, and if you're pretty confident about the color of your tubes, getting like a good matched set, then you don't really have to worry about getting 4. So the idea is we plug all these in, and then on top of this we plug in our actual tubes. So we got our EL84s, our lovely fancy ones, and we plug them in like so that they can actually function, and we can basically probe them while they're also plugged in and working. Tricky bit is going to be actually getting access to the little bias probe, to the little bias pot underneath the chassis while these are working and plugged in. So we're going to have to find a way to actually kind of flip this thing over while these tubes are running. So that's going to be a little bit tricky. Once we have our plate to cathode voltage calculated, we can go about calculating our final current or bias current that we want our amp to be running at in a couple of ways. We can use this site, which I'll get to in a second, which has a calculator. We can use an actual like equation to calculate it, or we can use a general chart like this to get an approximate estimate. So this is just another random video on how to do this kind of process that I found that helped me through this process. They have got a little chart here which has a lot of examples of sort of classic amps and the general average recommended bias settings. So for example, this amp here is a Laney, but it is based off of a sort of typical Marshall 100 watt JMC 800 type thing, and it runs. And this one, well, it could run on a couple, like I said, the 6L6 tubes, but the ones I'm putting in are the EL34 types. So this rating here could come pretty close to what we want. EL34 tubes, by the way, they are rated at 25 watts, so 4 of them make 100 watts of output power. That's how you kind of know how powerful your amp is. You'd use this graph by finding like an approximate amp that's close to yours. For example, I could use this 100 watt Marshall, or I could use a standard 80 to 135 watt amp class AB. These amps generally are class AB of this sort of size, the 100 watt amps, and they run at about 450 to 500 plate voltage. And like I said, my one runs at 484, so that does fit into there, and that would mean that the current you'd want for your bias to be would be about 20 to 40, or in the case of this Marshall, 25 to 40 here. So in that approximate range is what you can use if you don't really want to mess around with calculations and stuff. However, you can use this site here, which is a really great resource. I'll have links to it in the description below. And the way you do it is you find the tube type that you want. So in my case, we're looking for an EL34. So there's an EL84. They're different. They're much smaller tubes. But we're looking for an EL34. There we go. EL34. We'll just go for the basic type here. And then the plate voltage we have is, again, 484. So 484 for this example. How do we get this to work? Oh, we just click calculate. There we go. Now, the part that we're interested in should be the class AB fixed biased, because this is a fixed bias amp, class AB. So that would mean that we could go between 25.8 to about 36 is the maximum recommended setting. The average, which is a good starting point, is about 31. So that's what we're going to do. We're going to check where this amp's at currently, and then we're going to set it to where it's showing off at about 31. So we're going to try that out now. Alright, so I've got the amp all set up upside down where we can actually reach into the inside now. The speaker is plugged in, the little current monitoring doohickeys are plugged in, and the valves are glowing hot now. It's on standby at the moment. And yeah, this is going to be interesting. So the best way I can describe the way I've put this amp up is a bit precarious. It's not the best way to have this standing in this way, but it seems to be doing the job. Now's the exciting part where we can actually test and see what bias current is actually running through this stock currently. Because I'm really curious, because again, we want it at about 31.2-ish, something like that, 32 milliamps, just for those of you who don't know. And all we need to do now is add power to our little tester thing. Now let's have a look. Where? 0. Come on. Oh no, don't tell me this thing doesn't work. Oh, that's right, we gotta take it off standby. Okay. Here we go, here we go. We are at 33 on tube number A, 32 to 31, tube number 2, number 3, 30, 31, D, 32. Okay, that's really, oh no, 36 or 37. That one is running a little bit hot, so it is recommended that we actually use the hottest tube out of all of them, and we base our reading off of that. The thing about this amp was I was expecting it to be far more out of the range that we generally were expecting, so I will turn it down a bit. Now, I was going to use like a little wooden prod thing, but all I actually have on hand that actually fits in there, because it's such a tiny little pot, is actually this little scalpel knife, but I've insulated the handle a bit, and, you know, do as I say, not do as I do, so as long as I just touch that potentiometer, we shouldn't really have an issue, so hopefully I can adjust that, and hopefully I can show you guys the process. So here's our bias pot, and what I'm going to try and do, that one's running at like 38 now, 39, geez. So what happens if we take it this way? 36, 35, 34. Okay, that's a little bit closer to the way we want. It's at 33 now. So that should be good. What I'm going to do is I'm actually going to run my guitar through it, and we're going to take a listen to it, what it sounds like now. Again, we can turn up a little bit. Let's finally see what this thing sounds like. It's volume. We got a really scratchy sound going on there. I'm not sure if it might just be dirty pots or something. Jeez. I don't know, this switch also isn't working, which is kind of odd. This is kind of working for the drive, but it's... Alright guys, so I spent a little while just playing through it and testing out some different settings, and yeah, I don't know, I think whatever's the issue with this amp has nothing to do with the biasing of it. I've set the bias up as best as I can. Another thing I forgot to mention was I actually went back in with my multimeter and I actually checked the plate voltage with these probes while the amp was on with the tubes plugged in, which is something I didn't do before. Like I showed you guys I did it from the outside when I had the tubes pulled out, so it was sort of a safer method, and yeah, it was pretty much identical results. I think it only adjusted by like a volt or two. It came out as 482 volts its way, but beforehand, when we did it from the outside, it was 484. So realistically, that's not enough of a difference in the voltage to really cause any real difference to the actual bias measurement that we were going to get. So I recommend doing it that way. It's a little bit safer than poking these things around while the amp is live with the tubes plugged in, and you're doing it from the underside with all the risky wires. From the top is a little bit more safer. So yeah, that's just another thing I wanted to add. Thank you guys for bearing with such a convoluted video. I hope it's been making sense, and I hope it isn't a little spazzy and jarring and all of that, because there's a lot going on in this video, because I was, troubleshooting along the way. It's getting a little bit confusing. So I'm actually filming this segment like a week or two later than the previous segments, because I want to put a little bit of an epilogue at the end of this video just to cap it off and let you know where this amplifier is at, how I actually fixed it, because I fixed it. It works, and it works really good. So let me talk you guys through that. So first of all, I figured out what the issue of the sound was, and it wasn't the biasing. Funny thing is, I never really needed to bias this amp. Like, yeah, it's actually really recommended that you always bias an amplifier when you do change out the tubes. However, the stock bias that it was set at just so happened to be within the range of a good bias for these tubes. So I would have been okay had I not biased it. However, through this process, I'm actually really happy. Like, it's stressful and costly to fix this amplifier, but I'm actually really relieved and happy that now I learned how to bias an amplifier. I now know that, and I can do that in the future confidently without having to stress about it as much. And I just got that new skill in the toolkit, as it were. So that's probably the best thing about this amplifier being broken as it was. But as you can see, no longer broken. It's all put back in its box. It's all phenomenal, just how it is right now. And the way I got it there was I found out that there was some loose wires in the amplifier that I didn't notice previously, and they were both on the drive switch right here. So this little switch here, I noticed that was having some issues, like the light wasn't turning off even when I was flicking with the switch and messing around with it. So I gave it a closer inspection, and it turned out that the wires that were attached to that switch actually were broken off. So I have no idea how that happened. Was it just like an early manufacturing error? Or did the impact that smashed that tube inside the amplifier actually break those solder joints somehow? It's bizarre to me, I have no idea, but when I did resolder that, the amp was sounding proper. It sounded like a real tube amp. Finally, it was not sounding really spazzy and like just bursts of weird, like, unmusical fuzz. It had like the proper distortion sound. It was still noisy though. The amplifier was still really loud. There was just like loud sound coming out of it when I wasn't playing the guitar. So that was another issue, and the way I fixed it, because I was initially worried that it was the capacitors in here, because these tube amps, they have some filtering capacitors is what they're called, and they're the dangerous ones in these amplifiers. They're the big capacitors that could potentially kill you. So that was a bit scary, because I didn't want to have to deal with replacing those, because apparently you should get them replaced every decade or two. However, luckily I figured it out. The other thing that it could be besides those capacitors, and the way you kind of can tell is by the pitch of the sound. If you have some bad tubes in the preamp section, especially those first couple of tubes in the preamp. So what I did is I replaced the first tube in the preamp with a new 12AX7, and that fixed it. So it turned out that tube just wasn't really doing that good. And yeah, now it works perfectly, so I'm super happy about this. I hope this whole tutorial made sense to you. It's actually really simple now that I think about it. I could make a much simpler video, and I might do that in future on how to bias an amplifier. But to sum it up, I'm thinking of this off the top of my head because I did this like 2 weeks ago and haven't really revised it, but you need to get the plate voltage across pins 3 and 8 from the tube sockets. You can do that without having the tubes in there. It gets you a close enough reading from what I've calculated, because I did measure it both ways just to double check, as I mentioned earlier, and it is so close that it really, just for safety purposes, if you're a casual guitar tech or amp tech, that's going to service you just fine. So a good way just to pull out your tubes, turn on the amplifier, put the red one in tube 3, I believe, and the black probe into tube 8 to make sure your multimeter is on the correct setting, and measure that. You figure out what tubes you're going to be putting into it, you find out what wattage they're rated at, you put those two measurements in that website that I have in the description below, and then you get your bias reading. Then you hook up one of those do-wackies that you can get from eBay from China from pretty cheap that measure the actual current running the bias current, and then you see how your tubes compare to the recommended settings, and then you just adjust it until it fits within those settings comfortably, and you get a good sound. So that's basically biasing an amp in a nutshell. I hope this video has been helpful to you guys. If you're still a little confused, I'd be more than happy to try and do a more comprehensive, simpler video. This video is more like my own personal vlog about how I actually fixed this amplifier, more so than a proper comprehensive tutorial, so I do apologize about that. But, you know, this was really just me learning at the same time as I'm telling you guys what I'm doing, so I want to learn first before I do a proper comprehensive one for you guys. But I still feel that there's enough here that it could be helpful to you guys if you do watch this video. And I will have other videos linked to you guys that are the ones that helped me in this process. If I didn't lose those links, because I did lose some of the pages I had opened in this time since first filming this video and now filming this epilogue. So we'll see, but I'll still try to put as many resources as I can in the description of the video. So yeah, without further ado, what I'm going to do is I'm going to play you some sound demos from this amplifier. Nothing too fancy, I'm just going to noodle around for a little bit. And I might do a full review and comprehensive review giving a bunch of tonal variations from this amplifier later on, but I just want to show you guys how it's sounding now, just so you don't feel a little bit cheated because you didn't get to hear this amplifier, even though you watched like an hour's worth of footage of me fixing it. So yeah, I'm gonna cut away to that, and I hope you enjoy. What I'll be doing is I'll just be playing this lovely guitar through it. This is a guitar that I'm gonna or might already have a full review of on my channel. It is the brand new Epiphone 2020 range Epiphone Special SG with P90s. Love this thing. So you would have already heard this amp through that full review of this thing. So I've been yammering on for quite a while now. Let's just get into it. Just gonna start off fairly quiet, fairly clean. And then we're gonna build up from there, so yeah, let's get into it. has that drive channel. Again, I don't have it up too high, so it's not really getting super crunchy, but you can see it really boosts the sound compared to the normal chain of gain stages. So we can cut that out, and then we get a more sort of typical Marshall plexi kind of a sound. Again, it's pretty clean at the moment, so the volume boost you wouldn't even comprehend through watching this video, but when I click that switch, it goes like from 1 to 11 super fast. But we can just up the gain normally here, because I've only got it on, what's that, like on 2. This is the gain on 2 without that drive switch engaged. Right, but I've heard people say that a normal sort of Marshall plexi kind of thing maxes out at about a 7 on the normal gain thing without even engaging that switch, so this can get a lot more fuzzy. Now we're at a 7 on that normal gain stage, and you may have noticed I've got no effects running through this, no reverb, no extra pedals, no nothing, so we're getting just the raw guitar sound through this amplifier. Yeah, it's a good sound. It's just a good classic rock sort of distortion sound you can get out of this thing. It is really punchy, like, yeah, it's good. This amp is loud. Like, I have the volume is on like 1.5 right now, and it is very much like at the breaking point of being like, maybe this is too loud to kind of play around the neighbors. Like, this is generally my sort of recording volume. Granted, I live in units, so the neighbors are a little bit closer than you would be if you lived in a house, so I can't really drive it as hard as I would like. yeah, that was my little demo of this amp. I hope you enjoyed that. Pardon my playing, I'm a little bit rusty, but you know, it is what it is. We're here to hear the amp, not just my playing. So that's it for this video, guys. I'll see you in the next one. And yeah, thanks for sticking through this long video with me. It's been a pleasure to have you guys viewing. Keep on rocking, people. Peace out. Bye.